Before we begin, I would like to apologize in case this video is a little late. I wrote this originally as a blog post for my iCritic website and decided I want to try to turn it into a movie. I want to do more long-form editorials with visuals and music cues, and I keep forgetting how long it takes to edit, and if the Oscars have come and passed already, I do apologize, although I think the video still has some value, so thank you for watching. It's another year and another decade, and as such comes one of my favorite pointless yearly traditions, waking up early in the morning to watch the Oscar nominations. As always, I am not completely happy with them. After all, it's hard to imagine a race without William Dafoe from The Lighthouse, Awkwafina from The Farewell, Eddie Murphy from Dolomite Is My Name, or Adam Sandler from Uncut Gems being nominated. While I'm happy for Scarlett Johansson, her double nomination seems like overkill, and I can't help but wonder if she really needed to be nominated for Jojo Rabbit when Marriage Story is clearly the movie voters want to go for. And Best Documentary? Well, let's just say this is the 5th year in a row where the Best Documentaries of the Year didn't even get nominated. There will likely be many articles debating the snubs and surprises. There will surely be videos made about the lack of diversity and how women were shut out of the race this year. I'm not here to make those videos. They have their place on the internet, to be sure, but that place is not here. Instead, I'd like to discuss my favorite category that gets little love from my journalistic peers, as I feel this year the category finally did some soul searching and decided to course correct what was shaping up to be a category that was far too corporate and on the verge of losing its reason for existing. Best Animated Feature. It's fascinating to read the pundits during the Oscar race when they make their predictions and glance at what they believe will be the nominees in this category. With the exception of the filmexperience.net, it's clear most of these sites don't give much thought about the category, predicting the most lazy, uninspired predictions. In almost all these cases, those predictions can be summed up as, what did Disney and Pixar make this year? For those who want to see what I'm talking about, do a search for Oscar Predictions 2020 in whatever search engine you use, and you'll find article after article predicting the same movies. Abominable, Frozen 2, How to Train Your Dragon: The Missing World, Missing Link, and Toy Story 4. You look at predictions like those and you can't help but want to shake your head in defeat. While I do agree that part of the job of a pundit is to predict what the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Scientists members will actually vote for, I don't understand why they will try to bring the voters' attention to all these important documentaries, performances by actors in foreign language films, and champion screenplays for independent films that make less than a couple $1 million, all while caring so little about the art of animation that they just predict everything Disney, Pixar, and, to a somewhat lesser extent, DreamWorks is making. I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with pundits pushing for the kind of recognition in those other categories, because they should, obviously. It's just odd that with how much great animation there is in the world, the mainstream hits are predicted to the point where it gets depressing. This year in particular had many great animated films that the pundits and film critics should have been highlighting over Frozen 2. Where were the think pieces for why Funen would be a great nominee for Best Animated Feature? Why wasn't Weathering with You a serious contender in many of the pundits' eyes to be a nominee for Best Animated Feature? After the nominations were announced, it became a surprise hit in the US financially, so why wasn't it seriously considered by prediction sites before it became a big hit? I saw Buñuel in The Labyrinth of the Turtles way back in April, and it's a movie about famed director Luis Buñuel attempting to revive his career after L'Age d'Or nearly destroyed it because of its controversial, and some would say atheistic, content. This is the kind of movie Academy voters and film historians love. It's about a real-life figure, it's about the art of filmmaking, and it tells a great comeback story from one of the great directors who could have easily fallen into obscurity had fate not turned around in a very funny and unique way. So why was it never really in discussion to be nominated for Best Animated Feature? If these film pundits truly cared about the art of film, they would care about what animation was producing and would be championing some of these films instead of going, well, Frozen 2 is the highest grossing animated film of all time, so I guess that wins. It's not for the record, but I don't want to get into the whole Lion King debate right now. To explain how the voting process works for the Academy Awards, it should be noted that all the Academy branches vote for their own categories with the exception of Best Picture, in which all the branches vote for Best Picture. Therefore, you have sound mixers voting for sound editing and mixing, you have costume designers voting for costumes, and you have cinematographers nominating cinematographers. When the voting for Best Animated Feature started, animators and people in the industry voted for the nominees, which ensured that we got some truly outside-the-box thinking, which resulted in movies like Song of the Sea, The Tale of Princess Kaguya, and A Cat in Paris getting nominated over quote-unquote sure things like Monsters University and Cars 2. Then, a couple years ago, the Academy changed their rules to make it so that everyone in the Academy could vote for Best Animated Feature. On paper, it sort of makes sense. After all, animated features are considered pictures. Everyone can watch them, and like Best Picture, there should be no one type of person who should get to nominate them. The problem is, we're dealing with an Academy that is largely indifferent to animation, and most members have gone on record to say that when it's time to check their ballots for Best Animated Feature, they usually just ask their kids and grandkids what movies they like. That's how the poorly conceived The Boss Baby can get an Oscar nomination, while true works of art like Your Name and A Silent Voice get overlooked. It's why a good but fairly mundane film like Ferdinand gets to call itself an Oscar-nominated film, while the much more colorful and creative The Big Bad Fox and Other Tales gets forgotten. It's also why when the Golden Globes announced their nominees for Best Animated Feature, the rest of the awards pretty much look like a copy and paste of that list because most voting bodies don't want to take the time to see if there is anything worth nominating outside of the mainstream studio system. By the way, it's the indifference towards animation from this Academy, which is why the documentary branch exists, because most Academy members simply do not care enough about the art of the making of documentaries to make good calls in the documentary field. Not that the documentary branch does it a whole lot better, but that's an entirely different story. Which brings us to this year's Oscar nominations and the purpose of this video. When John Cho and Issa Rae got to the Best Animated Feature category, I braced myself for major disappointment. I truly believed the first nominee I would hear would be Abominable, and it would all be over from that point on. We'd get a list of mainstream films that were made by Disney and DreamWorks, and more unique films would be left to the side. Instead, the first nominee announced was How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. And while many would rightly point out that this is a DreamWorks film, I laughed with genuine excitement as not only had we been spared a nomination for Abominable, a good but at best 3.5-star movie in my opinion, but because the movies are nominated alphabetically, it meant the Academy snubbed Disney in the category they have spent millions of dollars trying to own for the past decade. When they announced I Lost My Body as one of the nominated films, I admit to doing a little bit of a happy dance. It was nice to see one of the year's most unique films that had been ignored on the awards circuit so many times finally get some recognition. When Klaus was announced shortly afterwards, it was a great feeling to know that 2 films made with 2D animation were nominated in a single year. Missing Link followed, and while I'm not the biggest fan of that movie, Laika is still doing interesting things in the field of animation, so I don't begrudge their place here. The only nominee that seemed undeserved was Toy Story 4, but then the movie also got an inexplicable nomination for Best Song as well, which, I can't let you, I can't let you, I can't let you throw yourself away. I guess the voters must really just like Toy Story movies. Either way, this list reminded me of past years where the Academy voters did their homework and nominated movies that weren't mainstream or popular, but just really, really good. Although I should mention that the 2 movies that reigned on Disney's parade were both distributed by Netflix, which means we could wind up with a new problem of Netflix being one of the big studios that barges into the Oscar race and campaigns enough that they could become the new controllers of this narrative. There are concerns about Netflix picking up distribution rights to animated films and then dumping them onto their streaming service as they bypass the far superior theatrical experience altogether. This could also be a case where the voters were just more aware that these movies existed as opposed to others because they were on Netflix, and thus they didn't even have to leave their house to know that they existed or heck to even watch them. I acknowledge these could be issues. From where I'm sitting right now, though, the nominations for Best Animated Feature this year were much bolder than they had any right to believe they would be, and seems to signal a return to when the Academy nominated what they felt was good, as opposed to nominating what Disney told them to vote for. We're actually in a position where any of these movies could win on Oscar night, and I'd be pretty happy either way, and that's a good feeling to be in. Unless Toy Story 4 wins. Then it will show that the Academy hasn't learned a damn thing.
And the Oscar goes to Toy Story 4. And